as I get closer to where he went off the road, I see a big black shape in the middle of the road walking. So I have to slam on my brakes and try to swerve myself because this thing is walking in the center of the road. Because I don't see a head and I don't see arms. I just see a really big, tall person, like big, thick legs and a big, thick torso. And they're moving very funny.
But to be honest, I wish I had have seen some of her vulnerability. I wish I'd have seen her in that space so that I would have language.
And he says, no. That's not why you're angry. That's why you're mad. Mad is on the surface. Mad is a surface emotion. You're angry. And anger is deep. It cuts to your soul. You are an angry young man. And I couldn't answer. I then had come to realize over the next course of a few hours, I'm musing to myself, and I realize I've been a victim my whole life. That's why I'm so angry. And over the course of the next 19 months, this man changed my life. He helped me to realize about processing emotion and how to forgive myself and forgive others. And that's where the metamorphosis really began for me. And I learned I'm a survivor, right? I know how to survive.
I was understood for the first time in my entire life. And when I read those things and I learned, quote unquote, those things about myself that I had known forever, but never really had the semantics for, I couldn't unlearn them. Like I heard this quote years ago and it resonated with me so much. And it's like, you can choose to look the other way, but you can never again say you didn't know.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Verbal Echo podcast. I'm really excited to welcome my guest tonight, Dr. John Baranchok. He's a clinical psychologist with years of experience in neuropsychology. But what really caught my attention was his deep dive into the world of Sasquatch research. John isn't just theorizing from an office, he's out in the field, boots on the ground, applying scientific methods to investigate one of the most elusive legends out there. He wrote a book called Grasping Sasquatch, Prepping for Scientific Field Research, which is all about how to approach this mystery with actual scientific discipline, not just stories around a campfire. His perspective blends a real understanding of the human mind with a curiosity about the unknown. He's been on other podcasts like Bigfoot Club, The Uncomfortable Podcast, and Bigfoot and Beyond with Cliff Bergman and James Bolofé. He's got 6 years of field work under his belt with BFRO. He has had several Class B encounters, and he also has done work with Manimal Research of the Southwestern Sasquatch Investigations Organization. He's got a podcast of his own, which was 36 episodes, based on his book called Grasping Sasquatch Stories in Scientific Fieldwork. This recording ended up being over 2 hours long, and so I decided to release the first half this week, and the second half will be the latter part of this conversation. But definitely tune in next week for the second half. We really went down a lot of rabbit holes. We went in many different directions. And if you enjoy the first part of this, definitely tune in next week for the second half. I think you'll be really surprised at some of the topics that John and I talk about. It was pretty profound. So without further ado, I'm going to kick it off, and I'm going to welcome John to the podcast. Welcome, John, to the Verbal Echo podcast. I'm really excited to have you here. We're going to talk all things Sasquatch, and just want to welcome you on, and if you want to get started and introduce yourself and tell us how you got involved in this.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Monica. Thank you for having me on. It's an honor to be here. I got involved in this. First experience was when I was working on a doctorate in New Mexico. And then I had to change universities. And so got my degree from Texas Tech. And after being in my private practice for a bit, I decided I want to trout fish again. So I was looking for maps on trout fishing, ran across BFRO maps, and got in on one of Lori Wade's expeditions. And that was my first exposure to a Bigfoot expedition. And my plan was to fish and do Bigfoot, a little bit of both, because oftentimes around a lot of trout streams or lakes when you're looking for Bigfoot. And so I got involved with Lori Wade's BFRO group, did a bunch of expeditions with them, did some expeditions with Charlie Raymond's BFRO group, as well as his Kentucky Bigfoot research organization, and do some with Manimal Research, which is Siwayne Totharo's group. I've had two definitely butt-puckering experiences. One of them being on a Lori expedition out in Tennessee. Would this be a good time for me to talk to you about that?
Yeah, I'd love to hear this story. This was a BFRO, right?
Yeah. This was a BFRO expedition. And there were about, 35 people on as a large group on the expedition. But then they break you up into expedition groups of between 3 and 5 for your night operations. And so we had 3 groups to a total of 15 people going on a night op where we were going to divide up into smaller groups once we got to a midway base camp, if you will. We forded 3 streams, hiked about halfway up the mountain, and up that mountain was an old log cabin. The guy that built it during the Civil War was trying to avoid the draft, which was called the consignment back then. And so he hid up in the Tennessee hills to avoid getting consigned. And so that was kind of our base camp for the night. And then I was in a group of 4. 3 stayed at the cabin. That's 7. And then one group of 4 was supposed to go up above us, and I think one group was supposed to go down below us. The group that we were supposed to hike up this deer trail, and one of the subgroups take a right and the other take a left, and hopefully meet around behind the mountain. We took a wrong turn, and I think they might have taken a wrong turn too. But it was myself, a good friend by the name of George Wrigley, another good friend by the name of Mark Ogleby, and another good friend by the name of Dan Kegley. George and Mark were seasoned expedition members. Dan and myself were newbies. I think it was both our second expedition when this happened. So we left from the cabin. It had been raining all night, and so we had to get to the main fire road. We had to climb up a deer trail, and it was more of a clay bank, so it was kind of slippery. You really had to be careful climbing up, getting to the top of the fire road. We got to the top of the fire road, and we started walking up this unkempt fire road. and all you could hear was the sound of the leaves rustling in the wind and the sound of water kind of trickling down the mountain. You couldn't hear, most impressive to me, given those conditions, you couldn't hear any tree frogs. Usually when it's like that, you're going to hear those small kind of green tree frogs making sounds. You couldn't hear any tree frogs, no crickets, no chipmunks or squirrels scattering in the leaves under the trees. We didn't see any deer. We didn't see any or signs of deer or any turkey or signs of turkey. We were having a hard time getting a hold of the group we were supposed to meet, but eventually we got to a point in the mountain where we were able to connect up with them on the walkie-talkies. And that's when we discovered wrong turns were taken and we were never going to connect. But these guys they had spooked turkeys rousting in the trees. They had spooked turkeys rousting on the ground. They had seen deer, all kinds of chipmunks, squirrels, and they saw evidence of pigs had been rooting in the road. The road was torn up from pigs in it. So they had all kinds of wildlife and all kinds of signs of wildlife, and we had nothing. So as we're walking up this trail, I said to George, I said, George, you always tell me that when Bigfoot's around, the whole forest is going to go silent. And this is pretty silent. Is this the kind of silence you're talking about? He said, well, it is pretty silent, but typically when there's a Bigfoot around, your spidey senses tingle. Your spidey senses being that sense that you're being observed or watched. So I said, okay. So we walked up the trail a couple hours, eventually caught up with them, realized that we were never going to connect. So we started walking back down the fire road trail, the fire road that we had come down. And George was in the lead. I was behind him. Dan Kegley was behind me, and Mark Ogleby was behind him. About 5 feet apart, single file. And this particular group of guys, for some reason, liked it when I would talk about hypnosis, and we would talk about how hypnosis might have applications to Bigfoot or influence Bigfoot. My background's in psychology. I've got a doctorate in counseling psychology. And so we were having one of those conferences, or talks rather, and I said something. I don't even remember what I said, but whatever I said, as we were getting closer, still had a little distance to go, but getting closer to the deer trail down to the cabin, I said something and it made George stop dead in his tracks, pivot on his heel, and take like 3 steps towards me. And he said, and he was trying to say John, and all he could get out was the first syllable of my name. And we heard an explosion above our heads. It sounded like a bomb going off, or dynamite going off right over our heads. And immediately followed by that, the sound of a landslide happened. And it was like you could hear what sounded like logs and stones rolling from the top of this mountain down the steep side of the mountain. And occasionally they'd hit a bump and they'd become airborne and they'd get silent until they hit the ground again. And then you could hear them tumbling and rolling again. So my thought was, crap, we're going to get killed by a landslide. I thought we were going to get killed by a landslide. George was recording. As it turned out, we had that landslide sound coming at us for only 14 seconds, but it seemed like an eternity. when all that transpired, George and I jumped and scurried a little bit further down the trail. Mark, he scurried a little further up the trail, and Dan Kegley, God bless him, he just pivoted on his heel, looked up the mountain, and pulled for his K-bar knife, ready to take on what was ever coming at us. I subsequently nicknamed him Braveheart for that, because we were scattering like cockroaches and he was ready for battle. But so all that transpired. It seemed to be going on around both ends of the line, extending 50 yards along the trail on either side of us. So if in fact it had been a landslide, the little bit that us scurrying types did, it wouldn't have helped us much.
Had it been raining? Was there mud, or was it?
It wasn't raining on us that evening. It had been raining all the night before. And one of my thoughts was, well, the rain could have eroded a tree and the tree fell over. But the explosion, we never saw, we looked and looked and looked for a fallen tree. Couldn't find a fallen tree, but it sounded like the tree immediately exploded and cracked rather than a falling sound and then cracking when it hit the ground. So it sounded more like a pushover than a brake pushover than a pushing over of the tree or just a falling of the tree. So they radio up from the cabin, did you guys hear that tree pushover? Oh yeah, it sounded like a bomb just exploded over our head. We're going to check it out. So we spent half hour, 45 minutes trying to figure out what happened. Not a single stick or, I was expecting either boulders or big rocks or stones to be coming down onto the fire road from the landslide. Nothing like that hit the road. But as we were looking up, and I smelled it before I saw it, but I couldn't put it together. But when I looked up the mountain, I could see these fine brown dust particles floating down on top of us. And then I recognized the smell. It was a smell of loam, which is kind of a very fertile soil that gardeners use. And I think if you compost your garbage, you can produce loam, depending on the mix of your garbage. So we all started to smell that. So it was definitely something above us. We spent half hour, again, 45 minutes trying to debunk it. Couldn't figure anything out. By this time, it's about 2:30, 3 o'clock. So we decided to just move on. So we put 2 sticks in the ground, forming a vertical X, standing up, with the aspirations of coming up the next day in the daylight and trying to see if we can find anything. And we start hiking probably the last 200 yards down the fire road to get to the deer trail down to the cabin. And just as we're about to get to the deer trail, the 3 at the cabin radio up to us and say, are you on the fire road or on the deer trail now? We're on the fire road, but we're about to hit the deer trail, 10-4. We start down the deer trail. We're about midway down the deer trail, and they radio up to us again. And by this time, at least myself, but I think all of us were getting irritated with the interruptions of the radio up. They radio up to us again. Are you on the fire road or are you on the deer trail? We're on the deer trail now. Why do you keep radioing us? Well, when you were walking down the deer trail or the fire road, we either saw some orbs or some big eye shine following you about 30 yards behind you. And now that you're on the deer trail, we see those same red orbs following you down the deer trail. So we pivoted around and looked up, and we couldn't see a thing. Got down to the cabin. By this point, all 15 of us were at the cabin and just kind of resting up before we hiked the rest of the way down to the mountain to get to our cars to go back to our true base camp. And all of a sudden I hear somebody say, look at that in the woods. And then somebody else says it. And finally it gets my attention of what are you guys whispering about? What are you guys doing? Look at those red eyes peeping out from behind the trees next to the deer trail. And I look out, and about 1.5 feet off the ground, I see a red glowing eye pop out from behind a tree, just one eye, and then pop back behind the tree, and then pop back out of this other side of the tree. And I watched that for a while, and more people are talking, look at that. And I kind of step back and look at the big picture. And honest to God, this was going on. We didn't count them exactly. I tried twice. I got different numbers, between 20 and 23 different locations, trees in the woods, just on the other side of the deer trail that we just came down. And the eye glow was coming out anywhere from about 1.5 feet to about 3 foot up the tree, different levels. And we all sat there and watched that go on for 20 minutes. And I can't say that they were orbs. This, to me, was eye glow. The reason I say eye glow rather than eye shine is that everybody's lights were off. There was no moonshine that night. The skies were completely clouded over because there was still more rain in the forecast. So I couldn't see any visible light that could be reflecting off their eyes. We watched that for
Did
at
anyone
least,
get a picture?
I think some folks got a picture, but I've never seen any. I've never seen any.
No one had night vision or anything like that. It was just visual.
Not to my knowledge.
And you said they were 1.5 to 3 feet off the ground, or 1.5. So they were not that tall.
Right. Yeah. They were small. We didn't have any 6 to 10 foot orbs or eyes, stepping out from behind a tree or doing the peeping. It was just lower down. Any other questions?
That's really interesting. What was the consensus when you were all together? And
well, we felt like we were looking at juveniles and infants peeping at us. So we go back to camp. The next morning, all of us old farts wake up stiff and sore, and there's no way we're going back up to that X that we stuck up there, because it was about 3/4 up the top of the mountain. But a young guy, Mixon was his last name, Mixon, fresh out of the military, deer hunter, great shape. He says he's going to hike up there. So we told him to look for the X on the fire road. I'll be darned if he doesn't find an adult Bigfoot print very close to that X. So he comes running down the mountain, hops in his car, gets back to base camp, tells us he's found a print, goes up with Tom Bruins, who is a excellent researcher and knows how to do casting. So they grabbed a casting kit, went back up there again, and casted that print. And while they used hydrocal, and even when you're using hydrocal, you still got to give it time to solidify. A lot faster than plaster of Paris, but it still takes time to set, is the word I'm looking for.
Mm-hmm.
So as the cast was setting, they started looking around other areas around this footprint, and we had been looking up the hill all night. Well, they went to the drop side of the road, and just a few feet back up the fire road from where this happened, they found a partial adult print over the edge of the road. And 15 foot up the tree, a fresh bark tear, almost like something had been standing partially on the edge of the road and
reaching
and tore some bark off. And when they looked down over this ledge, because initially it was a pretty straight drop down, when they looked down over this ledge, about 10 feet down was this muddy plateau. And it was full of mud because of all the rain and the drainage onto this plateau, muddy drainage. And they counted between 35 and 40 infant and juvenile Bigfoot prints.
Wow.
On that ledge. And so
it's almost like you ran into a nursery.
Exactly. We either stopped at a nursery or a playground, and I think we were bluff charged rather than a landslide. The print that he cast was 17 and a half inches long, and I want to say like 6 3/4, 6.5 to 7 inches wide, somewhere in between there. And with the exception of missing a single digit in the great toe, it was like looking at an X-ray. You could see every individual bone in all the toes, except the second to last joint in the great toe. But you could see the last joint in the great toe, and it still had the dermal ridges on it, and all the toes had dermal ridges on it. The soles of the feet, you could see the mid-tarsal break. And that's the first and only authentic Bigfoot cast I've seen. I've seen other replicas, people who have made recasts of their cast. But it was pretty impressive to see. I don't know. I think his name was Daniel Mixon. I don't know what he's done with that cast. He's not a social media type, keeps a low profile.
This might be a good point to ask about collection methods. I know you're a big science guy, obviously, and try to approach things from the perspective of gathering evidence. And I just in the few interviews that I've listened to what you had to say, it seems like the 3 T's, technology, tools, and techniques, is what I kind of came up with. And you mentioned this different material that's a little bit better in being able to collect dermal ridges and the bone structure of the foot, as opposed to using plaster. So do you think that might be something that we're improving on with collecting evidence? And then kick it off with whatever you want to say about collecting evidence, because I think that was one of the big questions I had for you is, where do you think this needs to go to not keep repeating the same stuff that people are just setting their camps about, doing the same kind of stuff like you mentioned for 50 years? Like, what do we need to do to change data collection and to,
Well, thank you for that question. That's an awesome question. and a potentially explosive question, I guess, depending on the words I choose to use. So everything I learned about, well, I've never poured a cast, so I'm not going to sit here and talk about how to pour a cast or what materials to use. There are people out there that can speak to that much greater than I can. Believe it or not, your T of technology, I'm probably one of the most anti-technology researchers out there, because I believe we've been sold a bill of goods that technology is the answer by Madison Avenue. You alluded to the 50-year time frame. Since the Patterson Gimlin film, we've been trying to get pictures of footprints, trying to cast footprints, trying to get pictures of Bigfoot, trying to get videos of Bigfoot, sharing personal experiences, Class A sightings. All those are valuable. And on one hand, all those are really valuable pieces of evidence and data. On the other hand, all those have already been rejected by the scientific community when presented in the Patterson Gimlin film. And so it's striking to me that people continue to go out and they continue to go out and do those things or make audio recordings. And it's not that there's anything wrong with that, but if your goal is to do research to prove the existence of the species scientifically, and then do some things to help them, help their habitat, their environment, those things just aren't going to do it. The Patterson Gimlin film has already taught us that. But I would say that's anywhere from 95 to 99% of the type of research that people do. It's fun. It's easy. There's not much. And honestly, with all sciences, with all the harder sciences, chemistry, physics, biology, the first step in something that has evolved into a true science is that it starts with observation. I think an example I like to use is Isaac Newton. He observed the apple falling from the tree. Okay. And then he noticed other things falling. Well, it's kind of like we saw the Bigfoot on the Patterson Gimlin film. And what we're akin to doing is like Isaac Newton traveling the world, just pointing to people and saying, see, look at the apple fall or look at the pear fall. That's great. You've observed something, but that doesn't tell you much of anything. That doesn't make it scientific. And of course, Newton and other people went on to do experiments on gravity. And ultimately, that's how gravity became an accepted phenomena, in our lives. Well, that's where we're at with Bigfoot science or Sasquatch science. We're still just walking around watching the apples fall. We're still just walking around looking for the pictures, looking for the footprints, but we're not doing anything with them. We're not taking the second step to develop a scientific community, which is scientific experimentation, running experiments based on the observations to help us prove Bigfoot as a species. And so that's a big part of what my book is about, is trying to teach people experimental design and statistical analysis. Of course, I'm biased, having a doctorate in psychology, but when you think about what psychology has done to quantify things and experiment with things, I think it's a perfect fit with Bigfoot. For example, emotions. We can see the behavioral effects of an emotion, but we can't touch or feel. You can't hold an emotion in your hand. It's a linguistic label for behaviors and feelings inside a person's body. Okay. So love isn't a concrete thing. It's an enigmatic, abstract thing. Intelligence, same way. You can't take x-rays of somebody's brain or stick wires down in their brain and tell how they are intelligent, how intelligent they are by that. You can't capture and have and hold intelligence. It's also intangible. Psychology has given us ways to test for it and measure that behavior. And if you see a piece of art or listen to a certain type of music, these people are geniuses in intelligence, but that's the byproduct of the intelligence rather than the raw intelligence itself. And Bigfoot is very much the same. It's hard to touch it, to have and to hold it. It's very fleeting. It's hard to quantify. It's hard to test. And so, because we've managed to solve some of these problems in humans, I think, and that's not to say that I think Bigfoot is a human necessarily, but I think we're well equipped to do experimentation with Bigfoot to kind of begin to add to the evidence in a scientific way that will help prove the species. So I've been trying to get people to get excited about learning how to do statistical analysis, learning how to do experimental
I just want to point out that you gave an example of the tree knock and doing it in a park where there are a lot of humans, and then taking that same experiment out in the forest where there aren't a lot of humans, and then documenting, running it like an actual experiment. Where's your control? Where's your, and I think that you have a really valid point there. And also, when you said something about your spidey senses, and I wrote that down because I still, in the back of my mind, feel like I might have had an experience at one point, and the only thing I can point to is that the forest went quiet. My spidey senses went off the charts. I just knew I had to get out of this place where I was in an abandoned campground, hiking with a friend, and and I just knew there's a predator around. And it could have been it could have been a mountain lion, could have been a bear, very possibly. But it just, and who knows? But just to this day, that's the only thing I have. And it's like, maybe that, I don't know. I don't know. And I'll never know what that was. But when you mentioned the forest getting quiet, and I was like, oh yeah, there's that thing again. But as far as like running experiments, I think your point's definitely valid. I think we do have to shift. We do have to start doing things a little bit differently, because we're still standing here shouting to everyone, "Hey, it exists! It exists!" And it feels like you're just saying the same rhetoric over and over again to the same people who don't want to listen, and then there are people who do want to listen.
Mm-hmm.
So where do we go?
Yeah. Um, one of the things I often say is before you drop thousands on your next FLIR or uh, drone, drop some of that money on a computer package to analyze data and learn how to use it. I, when we're marketed the technology, of course, it's going to be marketed to us in a way that enhances its performance to make it look desirable for what we want to do. And so that's not to say that having a drone with a FLIR camera on it or LiDAR on it. So with LiDAR, I guess you get the three-dimensional image. That's not to say that there's no value in that in reducing the time it takes to locate a potential target or a potential Bigfoot. But if you really want to learn about that potential species, or even necessarily learn if it's a Bigfoot, you still got to have boots on the ground. You still got to stalk it and sneak up on it and to observe it. And so I think, the most important tool we have is our own mind and our own body. Um, that spidey sense, that tingling, that feeling like you got to get away, that can be the beginnings of a fight-flight response. And our fight-flight behavior is hardwired into our body through our nervous system, through our peripheral and central nervous system. And it's also under automatic control. You don't have to necessarily think about, oh, I'm going to get the heebie-jeebies. They kind of come on you on their own. And so, one of the things I advocate for in terms of what do we do, and I teach people how to do this in my book, is to reprogram your fight-flight reaction so that you can stay calmer when those kind of situations arise, because the calmer, within reason, you can stay, the more accurate your observations and whatever you do after that is going to be. That's not to say you want to lay down on the ground and fall asleep when you're 90 feet from a Bigfoot. But, I've met a lot of people who have literally, after 1 to 4 previous Bigfoot sightings, Class A Bigfoot sightings, they pooped or peed their pants because they lost control of that fight-flight response. And that can be one of those symptoms. Also, if you look closely at what is involved, the symptoms that people, develop when they develop fight-flight, it's very close to a panic attack. Rapid heartbeat, shallow breathing, shakiness, got to get out, got to move or freeze. They're regulated by the same parts of our nervous system as our fight-flight responses. And as somebody who's treated people with PTSD, basically what we do is we teach them how to reprogram those emotional reactions and responses. But you can do that in a preventative way, so you're less likely to have them. I'm not sure.
I'm so glad you're mentioning this, because I teach meditation and pranayama breathing, and I do yoga, and that's one of the things that I have PTSD, and I did the whole therapy route, and it was very helpful. But then I also learned about EFT tapping. I've done EMDR. There's so many different things that you can do, but ultimately what's really available to you right then and right there is breathing. And I'm sure you could offer so much, and I'm sure it's in your book, like box breathing or whatever, to take you out of that fight or flight. Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because that was one of the questions that I wanted to ask was, or lead into, is this trauma that's associated with all of these encounters. These people, so many people are finding this avenue of speaking on podcasts because they have trauma related to their event, and they want to be validated. They want a brave space to talk about it and to tell their story and not be judged. And so I think that it's a huge thing, and it's so valid. I mean, it's just something about this personal experience that people are going through and are experiencing. And I'm so glad that you mentioned that.
Yeah. I think the most important thing along those lines is to recognize that they are dealing with trauma, that they are dealing with PTSD. Of course, many manly men are told that they don't have feelings, and it's not okay to cry. And these guys are likely pushing that trauma back, and it's one of those deals where if you don't deal with it now, you're going to deal with it on down the line. And there still is a lot of stigma associated with admitting to having an anxiety disorder or PTSD, much less as a result of a Bigfoot encounter. So it's hard to come forward and ask for that help, I think, for a lot of people. In response to, I just teach pursed lip breathing in my book. Okay. And then I teach progressive relaxation and autogenic relaxation in my book. My book has quite a few of appendices, and I have scripts in there that can be read into a CD player that you can then customize your own relaxation induction or whatever the case may be. But so yeah, learning some emotional self-regulation in whatever way floats your boat. Yoga is a good one. I think that's a good thing for people who are serious about doing research. I wanted to pick up on another point that you made, but it's slipped my mind. Did I answer your question or?
Oh yeah. And and
Okay.
honestly, I had a question. I had the honor of meeting Dr. Maria Mayer and Russell Acord at Phenomicon. And I follow their show and I watch, their evidence collecting. And she recently, I mean, she's the real deal. She's an amazing person, and it was just such an honor to meet her. And coming at it from a scientific point of view, them collecting the environmental DNA, the prints, obviously, but they've also exposed all these nests that they've found in Washington and Oregon and Northern California. Those were alarming. And that was the smoking gun for me.
The nests.
Look, the nests. Yeah. And also when they started, they were interviewing loggers, and I mean, these loggers in Northern California and all the way up the coast, they've known about this for 50 years. They've been finding these nests, and they've been told not to talk about them. And I think it's really cool that they're going out and they're collecting environmental DNA from the nests. And it's truly fascinating. So, yeah, I don't know if you have anything to say about that, with some of these things, the tree structures and the nests and the environmental DNA. And I know that's also like into the tech, and you were kind of saying, listen to your body, and kind of, like, what is your body telling you about this fight or flight? And you might be picking up on more. So, yeah.
Yeah. So, first of all, I haven't watched the first episode of that show that she is on. So I have never, I see the ads for it. I just haven't watched any of it. I think since Daniel, I'm blocking on Daniel's last name, a young man in the UK who found ancient ape eDNA in a forest in Britain. He's made quite a splash over the past year and a half. I think with that discovery, I think eDNA has become really trendy. And I think while it creates interesting questions to pose, I don't think it offers many answers because you can't recreate a full genome with eDNA. It's only a partial genome, so you're not getting the full picture of that DNA and the creature's parentage. I just watched a few minutes. I'm not even sure why I watched it, but I just watched a few minutes of an ad for this summary show that they did where they were mentioning they found orang DNA in some of those nests, and it wasn't even the predominant DNA in those nests. And she was upfront about that, explained that, but that really captured their eye, that they're finding orangutan DNA in these nests. So, what else? I'm not sure what else to say. As much as I'm sitting here on a YouTube or a Zoom recorded Zoom channel with you, once television production or documentary production gets involved in a project, for better or worse, compromises have to be made to make it saleable and to keep the pace and keep it moving. And I think the unfortunate thing about serious researchers getting involved with that kind of stuff is that I think that ultimately limits them, because they can't necessarily do or pursue what they would normally or naturally want to do because of production limits, setting limits on them. So I try and keep in mind that these types of shows, Finding Bigfoot, I mean, I was hooked on Finding Bigfoot when it first came out. But I think we all got to keep in mind is that these are primarily for entertainment purposes. And if we get valid scientific data out of them, that's all the better. And that's great. But we've got to understand the strengths and weaknesses of that data. Just this weekend, just yesterday, somebody was asking about, is there a Bigfoot in every state? And I looked for maps on Bigfoot concentrations in the United States, and I found one map that looked at the number of Bigfoot sightings relative to population density. And then I found another map that just looked at the plain number of Bigfoot sightings. And the Bigfoot map, looking at the number of reports according to population density, really painted a different picture than the one where they just looked at the raw number of sightings. And so this was one of the other reasons why I felt it was important to teach statistics and experimental design, because you got to know how to interpret that data and what to look for, or it can be misleading, for what it's worth.
Oh yeah, I remember my statistics class in college. I was a sociology and anthropology and journalism major, and oh, I sat through that class and I thought I was gonna die.
Yeah,
It's just like, oh God.
yeah.
I remember that. But yeah, no, I think you're right. The other thing I wanted to counterpoint um is that it's really hard if you are a doctorate, and you're passionate about something like Dr. Jeff Meldrum, Maria Mayer, and you want to research this. How are you going to get a grant? Nobody's going to give you a grant. So all of this stuff is expensive to go on expedition. And so it might be a way for you to explore your passion and get funding, and because who's going to pay for it? You have to find someone to pay for it, right?
Mm-hmm.
But no, I see your point about wanting to keep the integrity of the data that you're gathering, and I think that's what you're trying to say, is that there might be, yes, it's fun and everything, but I do think that there are people who are serious about it, and they are passionate about it, and they do want to gather scientific data and compile it, and they want to do it in an honest way, but it's like, who's going to pay for this? So
Yeah, that's been awkward for me. Of course, when you get a doctorate degree, you've got to write your dissertation, which is typically a study or an experimental study. And, so I've published some papers along the way. And you know what? There was never any, I'm sorry, there was never any barbecue sauce commercials involved in me getting research funding.
yeah.
And I'm sorry to have whoever I offend, but there's just, I totally see and understand what you're saying. You're not going to get a government grant to do this research. So you've either got to find a group that's interested, or you got to come up with some way to make money to put it into the research.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't validly argue against that.
That might be a good point to ask about BFRO, because I know that you have, I think I saw in some of your stuff that you did 6 years of field work, over 300 plus hours of boots on the ground in Georgia, Tennessee, and Kentucky.
Mm-hmm.
And so what's been your experience with BFRO? And if someone wanted to go on an expedition or become involved in that, it's like me. Maybe I told you it was going to be a selfish question in here. What would be the process? How does that work?
Well, so, one, I think if you have an interest in Bigfoot and you've never spent much time in the woods, and I'm not speaking to you personally, Monica, I'm just saying to anyone with that interest, I can't highly recommend enough getting with some kind of organization that mounts structured expeditions. Of course, BFRO sets the standard for that and has been doing that for quite a long time. There are other organizations out there, but I think if you're just getting started, spending some money on a few group expeditions is money worthwhile spending. If I had not done that, there's so much I would have never learned or never understood. So I think going on organized expeditions with people more experienced than you and being willing to pay for that, I think there's some value in that. From there, of course, for all of us, then it's a value to cost kind of consideration. The way, and I'm not doing a commercial for BFRO here, but the way BFRO works is you go to their website, you look at the United States map. They on one of the sub pages, I think they have like an expedition page link. You go to that page, and it's a map of the United States, and it's got little orange circles with numbers in them. And those numbers represent the number of expeditions that BFRO is mounting that year in that state. And so then you can scroll down by state, and they'll talk about who the leader is, and what you got to do to get on that expedition. You got to fill out an application. There are some liability forms, non-disclosure forms, things of that nature. You speak with the expedition leader, and unless you're a terrible jerk or just in some way totally inappropriate, I think they're pretty accepting. But there are other organizations out there, and I think actually in my book I list an extensive number of Bigfoot organizations in there. So, and then your typical BFRO expedition is getting together on a Thursday, having camp set up in time for dinner. After dinner, breaking into small groups, being assigned to small groups of 3 to 6 people, and then around 9 o'clock, as it gets dark, go out with that group and follow the leader on those night op expeditions. And depending on what kind of activity you'll get, some people will be back by 12. Some people won't be back until 4 o'clock in the morning. And then the next day after breakfast, they debrief. We debriefed and talked about what their experiences were. And that's a typical day in a BFRO expedition. At least it was for me. I think, that leaves it up to other expedition leaders exactly how to run their expeditions, but it's going to be very similar to that.
And just for clarification, can you explain the difference between a Class A and a Class B?
Sure. Class A is where you unmistakably see a Bigfoot, and it's clearly a Bigfoot and leaves no doubt that it's a Bigfoot. It's not a suit. It's not a bear. Most of them are daytime sightings because of that. And, oftentimes pretty close sightings. In a Class B encounter, it looks like it could be a Bigfoot, but you don't have the clarity of the vision of sight evidence or other evidence that it was made by that it was a Bigfoot. So, Class A is you see a Bigfoot. Either up close and personal or at a considerable difference. When you get into Class Bs, that's when you start getting into footprints being left. That's when you get into tree knocks where you hear the knock, but you can't see one making the knock. Growls and yells and screams after you've ruled out all other creatures potentially making those, recording those. bipedal footsteps, whoops. The more common phenomena that you see discussed that more people have are Class B sightings. And then Class C sighting is when you hear a story from somebody else about what happened to them rather than experiencing it yourself.
So if I found tree structures and I found a footprint, that I've had Class B sighting.
Yes, yes. Unless you saw the Bigfoot make that print,
Right. No, I did not.
or assembling the tree structures. Yeah.
Yeah.
There is one that I actually think that's explained in much better I explain that again in my book, but it's also explained on the BFRO webpage. And on that website, they do talk about one trail of tracks that, although Bigfoot was never seen making it, everything about the tracks, everything about the pattern of the tracks, the documentation, what is it called? The pedigree of the whole sighting, it still was considered a Class A sighting because it just couldn't possibly be anything else. But that's very rare and highly unusual. Usually the Class B sightings are the phenomena that most people experience that we attribute to Bigfoot when we're out in the woods.
This might be a good segue to start to ask you about woo versus flesh and blood, and what the two different camps that have evolved. Why do you think this has happened? And why do you think people get stuck in their camps? And there's a little bit of cross controversy. Yeah. And then also, I've also seen now that there's a little bit more of acceptance in accepting a little bit more of each other's ideas. However, it still seems a little campy.
Yeah. Yeah, I missed that acceptance part myself. But so let me say this. They don't have to be mutually exclusive. And as you observed, it's almost like they're two separate camps. You ever see the movie The Men Who Stare at Goats?
Yeah.
Okay. There is actually a brick and mortar school outside of Washington, D.C. that trains psychics in different abilities, and you can become not a certified psychic if you have those abilities, and they can help train and bring out those abilities in you. So, it seems to me, and I mean this in a complimentary way, largely because of Dr. Meldrum's work, I think flesh and blood is probably the predominant accepted theory for most people. And then, you have people who believe firmly in woo. And again, my thing is that, well, if there are humans with psychic abilities, telepathy, and you adopt the flesh and blood or kind of evolutionary view of Bigfoot, why might there not be Bigfoots with psychic abilities? And I've met very reliable people who have experienced mind speak, which is one of those woo phenomena.
Les Stroud came out and talked about his experience.
Did he?
Oh yeah. Yeah, he you can see his documentary out there, but it's floating around. But yeah, he came out and now he's doing talks on YouTube. I think I watched one a few weeks ago. But he speaks very emphatically about his mind speak experience. Yeah.
He also experienced cloaking. Scott Carpenter was his guide for those episodes. And Scott, at a talk that he gave on one of the expeditions I was on, mentioned that they had one uncloak and cloak right in front of him. So, so I guess the first point, one, even if you're a flesh and blood believer, it doesn't preclude the possibility of those kinds of phenomena as far as I'm concerned, number one. Number two, just as we haven't done scientific investigation on woo phenomena, we've done very well, and by scientific, let me just as we haven't done scientific experimental research into the woo phenomena, we really haven't done that much scientific experimental research into the flesh and blood phenomena. Dr. Meldrum has done a few experiments, but anthropology is taking a knowledge base and applying that knowledge base to what's in front of you rather than running an experiment with it. I mean, of course, you can run DNA samples and that kind of stuff, but, he looks at feet and can determine their gait and their walk based on his knowledge base. Okay. So I think both camps or areas need to be experimentally investigated more so. I don't believe in woo, but I don't disbelieve in woo, because I don't think we've looked hard enough at the evidence and tried to figure things out. In another interview, I talked about this experiment I have in mind for mind speak, but be it mind speak, be it zapping, where people kind of get disoriented and sick and nauseated, these things can be scientifically investigated with experimental design and statistics if you're willing to step out of the box a little bit. So I think, I say it in my book, I guess I'll say it on here. How can we consider ourselves objective researchers and scientists if we just say, oh, I'm going to put the blinders on to this evidence. We're only going to look at this much evidence and pretend the rest of the evidence doesn't exist. And I think that is a lot of what is happening with woo. If we had done that with medicine, for example, you used to go to the barber for a bloodletting, and the bloodletting was the solution to everything. And somebody comes along and says there's a germ. Well, where is it? Well, you can't see it because it's microscopic. If we'd still be stuck back in the dark ages if somebody didn't push the envelope and investigate things that can't be seen or aren't experienced by anyone.
Hey friends, thanks for joining in with us today. As I mentioned earlier in the beginning of this podcast, stay tuned next week for the second half of our conversation. I think you're really going to enjoy it and get a lot out of it. It goes even deeper than where we've been tonight. So hopefully we will see you next week. And just a little update, Verbal Echo podcast is going to the Nebraska Bigfoot Conference. I'm joining a friend there, and we may even go live. And I'm hoping to connect with anyone out there. And if you're in the Nebraska area, definitely shoot on over there. It is Friday and Saturday, and it's supposed to be a pretty good time. So I'm really excited about meeting some new friends and learning all we can about the big guy. So thanks again, and we'll see you next week. Hey, thanks for listening to another great episode. Be sure and like, share, or follow this podcast by leaving a 5-star review on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. If you have an experience you'd like to share, be sure and reach out to verbalecho@gmail.com. If you know someone who'd like to tell their story, please send them our way. I want to talk to them. No guardrails. Have a great week, friends. See you in the next episode.